Two men are cutting firewood in a forest in the country of Georgia. It is the 2nd of December 2001, and the cold has already turned serious. Then they find something that should not be there. Half buried near an old abandoned checkpoint, two metal canisters, dull grey, heavy, sitting alone in the snow with no wires, no fuel line, no fire. And yet, when they get close enough to touch them, they are warm. Warm enough, in fact, to keep two freezing men comfortable through a night that should have been unbearable. So they do the only sensible thing two cold men can think to do. They lean their backs against the canisters, and they sleep. Within 2 weeks, they cannot stand without help. The skin across their backs begins to blister, then fail. One of them will spend the next 893 days getting sicker, and doctors in 2 countries will not be able to save him. What those men found in the forest was never built to hurt anyone. It was built to save lives, quietly, automatically, for decades, without a single human being ever coming back to check on it. It was one of roughly 1,000 nuclear devices the Soviet Union scattered along its own coastline, and then, when the country that built them stopped existing, simply lost track of. Some of them are still out there tonight. Nobody outside a small circle of engineers can tell you exactly how many. This is the story of the lighthouses that were never supposed to need a keeper, and what happened when the keeper vanished. Chapter 1. A country with too much coastline. To understand why anyone would leave a radioactive device unattended in the wilderness for 30 years, look at a map of the Soviet coastline. More than 60,000 kilometers of it. Along the Arctic alone, the Northern Sea Route, the shipping lane connecting Europe to the Pacific across the top of the world, depended on hundreds of navigation lights and radio beacons, scattered across some of the most hostile, empty terrain on the planet. No roads, no towns. Months of total darkness and cold that could kill an unprotected engine in an hour. An ordinary lighthouse needs a keeper, or at least a diesel generator and someone to keep refilling it. Out here, neither was realistic. Reaching some of these stations meant an icebreaker, a helicopter, and a window of good weather that might not open again for a year. Some beacons stood so far from any settlement that the nearest human being, on an ordinary night, might be several hundred kilometers away. A dead battery there wasn't an inconvenience. It was a ship, somewhere out in the dark, missing the one light it was counting on. So Soviet engineers reached for a different kind of fire. Not combustion, decay. Certain radioactive materials give off heat simply by breaking down. No oxygen, no moving parts, nothing to maintain. Pack that material into a shielded canister, wrap it in thermoelectric plates, and the heat of its own decay generates a small, steady electric current. Enough, just enough, to power a light or a beacon for years, without anyone ever visiting. The device was called a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, the same basic technology NASA was using, around the same years, to power spacecraft too far from the sun for solar panels. The Soviet Union simply pointed the same idea at its own coastline and started building, quietly, at scale, for the next 3 decades. On paper, it was an elegant solution to an impossible logistics problem. Nobody stopped to ask the second question. What happens when the country that built them, and knows exactly where they all are, stops existing? Chapter 2. 1,000 Small Suns. Between the 1960s and the collapse of the Soviet Union, engineers installed roughly 1,000 of these generators. Along the Arctic coast, on Sakhalin Island, across the Kuril chain, and along the shores of Chukotka in the Far East. Each one held a radioactive isotope called strontium-90, a byproduct of nuclear fission cast into a ceramic-like glass so it couldn't easily leak or dissolve. And strontium-90 has a half-life of almost 29 years. Sit with that number for a moment. 29 years to lose half its radioactivity. Another 29 to lose half of what's left. These machines were built to outlast a maintenance budget. Nobody in the 1970s expected them to outlast the country that built them. The generators came in several models, manufactured mainly at a single factory on the Baltic coast in the town of Narva. Beta M, the smallest and by far the most common, gong, gorn, fear, growing steadily larger and hotter. Each one, at its core, was the same idea. A sealed radioactive heart, wrapped in steel and concrete shielding, bolted to a lighthouse tower or a beacon mast, and then left completely alone. For most of these machines, that is exactly how the story ends. Quiet, useful, forgotten. A Cold War engineering success story nobody outside the Navy ever heard of. For 30 years, that was the whole story. A generator would be installed, sealed, bolted down, and then for the rest of its working life, it would simply sit there, warm and silent, doing exactly one job, while the rest of the world forgot it existed at all. That was the design. That was the entire point. But 1,000 is a large number. And in a country the size of the Soviet Union, 1,000 of anything scattered across the wilderness means that sooner or later, the record-keeping has to fail somewhere. It failed faster and more completely than anyone had planned for. Chapter 3. The paperwork disappears. In December 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The Navy that had installed these generators fractured into new, cash-starved national fleets. The Transport Ministry that serviced remote beacons lost its budget, then much of its staff. And the registries, the maps, the maintenance logs, the lists of exactly which coordinates held a sealed radioactive source, scattered across offices in newly independent countries, some of which were no longer on speaking terms with each other. Nobody decided in any formal sense to stop looking after 1,000 nuclear devices. It simply stopped being anyone's job. The warning signs came early. In 1997, a helicopter servicing a generator near Sakhalin Island lost its grip on the load and dropped it into the sea. It was recovered, eventually. But for a while, a sealed radioactive source simply sat on the ocean floor, and the people responsible for it had to admit they weren't entirely sure how to get it back. Meanwhile, the lighthouses themselves stood exactly where they always had. Unlit, in many cases, their diesel-era neighbors long since stripped for parts. The radioactive generators still bolted to their towers, still warm, still generating a small, patient current, waiting for a maintenance crew that was never coming back. To anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, a Beta M canister looked like nothing dangerous at all. A heavy metal cylinder, government property, abandoned, in a country where abandoned government property was, by the late 90s, simply something you scavenged. In December 2001, 3 men found one. Chapter 4. 2 nights in the forest. The men were woodcutters working near the Nguri hydroelectric dam in a forested corner of western Georgia. It was early December, and by nightfall the temperature had dropped hard enough to matter. Near that old abandoned checkpoint, they found 2 dull metal canisters lying in the snow. No markings they recognized, no wires, no obvious purpose. Just 2 heavy objects that, when they got close, were unmistakably, impossibly warm. To 3 cold men a long way from shelter, warm metal in the snow was not a mystery to investigate. It was a gift. They gathered around the canisters the way you'd gather around a stove. 2 of them lay down that night with their backs pressed directly against the metal, using it exactly the way you'd use a hot water bottle or a banked fire. They did it again the second night. What they didn't know, what nobody had told them, because by then nobody was responsible for telling anyone, was that each canister was a Beta M generator, its strontium-90 core radiating at a level that, at close range and for hours at a time, delivers a dose to the human body measured not in a slow accumulation, but in catastrophic, immediate terms. The men absorbed whole-body doses that would, on their own, have been life-threatening. But the real damage was local. The parts of their backs and shoulders pressed directly against the canisters took a dose many times higher than the rest of their bodies. Radiation burns building silently beneath skin that, for the first days, looked almost normal. Symptoms began within 2 weeks. Nausea, fatigue. Then the skin itself began to fail, blistering, breaking down, refusing to heal. By the time doctors identified what they were looking at, all 3 men were suffering from acute radiation syndrome, a diagnosis rural Georgian hospitals had never had reason to make before. The International Atomic Energy Agency sent a team to secure the source in early 2002. By the time specialists arrived at that forest checkpoint in full protective gear to lift 2 canisters that 3 unprotected men had slept beside for 2 nights, the gap between what the equipment demanded and what those woodcutters had actually done was impossible not to notice. By then, the damage to the 3 men was already done. 1 was discharged after treatment, relatively fortunate. A second required more than a year of care, including skin grafts performed in Paris, and survived with permanent scarring. The third did not recover. He died on the 13th of May 2004, 893 days after he leaned his back against a warm piece of metal in the snow. Not from the burns directly in the end, but from the cascade of complications, heart failure, infection, that a body pushed that far past its limits struggles for years to survive. 893 days. Long enough that, for most of that time, he was simply a man living his life, slowly running out of one, because of an object that was never meant to be found by anyone at all. It would be comforting to call the Lear incident a freak accident. It wasn't. It was the first time this particular story made international headlines. It was very far from the only time it happened. Chapter 5. The Scavengers. Lear was not an isolated case of bad luck. It was a pattern, and the pattern kept repeating in stranger and more dangerous ways up and down the Soviet coastline. In 2003, on the Kola Peninsula in Russia's far north, scrap metal thieves broke into the housing of a Beta M generator at a lighthouse numbered simply 414.1. They weren't looking for radioactive material, they were looking for the heavy shielding around it, depleted uranium, dense and valuable as scrap. They stripped it away piece by piece and left the naked radioactive core sitting exposed at the site. Investigators who later measured the site recorded radiation levels of roughly 1,000 roentgens per hour at close range. A dose that high can cause severe radiation sickness within minutes and can kill after only a few hours of sustained exposure. The thieves themselves were never identified. Police reportedly checked morgues and hospital admissions across the region, assuming that whoever had handled that shielding at close range would soon need one or the other. No match was ever confirmed. To this day, nobody officially knows what happened to the men who did it. Further east on the Chukotka Peninsula, another generator went missing from its station around those same years. Its final fate never fully documented in any public record. Notice what's missing from the Kola story. No dramatic villain, no smuggling ring, no foreign spy. Just people poor enough and desperate enough to break into government property for scrap metal, in a country where by 2003, nobody had bothered to put up a sign explaining what that particular piece of government property actually was. 3 different regions, 3 different kinds of failure. A helicopter's dropped cargo, 2 cold men reaching for warmth, a scrapyard's blind greed. One thread running through all of them, 1,000 radioactive objects, and by the early 2000s, almost nobody left whose actual job was to know where they all were. Somebody eventually had to go and get them back. Chapter 6. The Recovery. By the early 2000s, the danger these generators posed had become impossible for anyone to ignore. What followed was one of the quieter, stranger cooperative efforts of the post-Cold War world. Norway, sitting just across the border from many of the worst affected sites, put up tens of millions of dollars through its Radiation Protection Authority. The United States, through its own nuclear security programs, contributed both funding and specialized recovery teams. The International Atomic Energy Agency coordinated the effort, working alongside Russian technicians who had to physically fly out to some of the most remote coastline on Earth and bring these things home. The work itself was almost absurdly difficult. Helicopters, icebreakers, and heavy lift teams reaching lighthouses with no roads, no ports, sometimes nowhere safe to land at all. extracting a shielded, decades-old radioactive core, sealing it into a transport cask built for exactly this purpose, and flying it out before the weather closed the window again. Each generator recovered was, essentially, its own small expedition. A typical recovery meant a small team in radiation suits, working fast in punishing cold, remotely testing a canister that had sat undisturbed since before some of them were born. Then wrapping it, lifting it by crane or by hand, into a cask built thick enough to stop what was inside from reaching anyone ever again, and getting off that stretch of coastline before the next storm rolled in. Multiply that scene by several hundred across a decade and a half in some of the harshest terrain on the planet. Site by site, station by station, the count climbed. By 2016, of the roughly 1,015 generators the Soviet Union had scattered along its coast, 751 had been recovered. Nearly every unit that field teams could still reach. More than 500 lighthouses were converted to solar power instead, quietly and permanently removing the radioactive option from the equation. The recovered material was sealed away at a storage facility called Mayak, deep in the Ural Mountains, out of the wind, out of the snow, out of anyone's backyard. It should have been a clean, satisfying ending, a Cold War mistake, quietly cleaned up by the very countries that had once pointed nuclear weapons at each other. It isn't, quite. The last fully confirmed count, from around 2015, put a small number of these generators, roughly a dozen, still active and unaccounted for, mostly on the remote Kamchatka Peninsula and Sakhalin Island. And in June of 2022, 4 months into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Norway suspended its nuclear safety cooperation with Russia entirely. The organization that had tracked this problem most closely for 2 decades was banned from operating inside Russia the following year. In the summer of 2025, Russia formally withdrew from the treaty framework that had governed this cooperation from the start. The same kind of collapse that scattered these generators across the Arctic in the first place, a sudden, total break in institutional oversight, has now interrupted the effort to clean them up. Nobody outside a small circle of officials can say, with real confidence, exactly how many of these devices remain unaccounted for tonight. Which means the story that began with 2 cold men finding something warm in the snow does not yet have an ending. There is something almost admirable about the original idea, a machine that needs no fuel, no crew, no maintenance, that simply keeps working, quietly, for longer than most governments survive. That is also exactly what made it dangerous. The Soviet Union built devices designed to outlast attention, and then it stopped existing before anyone finished the job of watching them. If stories like this, the strange, half-forgotten machines the Soviet Union left scattered across its own territory, interest you, there's another one waiting at the link on the screen. Thanks for watching.